Hey everybody. So we have talked a lot so far about kind of the basic foundation of music, okay? And now we get to move on to the things that make music interesting, the things that make music really worth listening to, right? So, first of all, we're going to talk about dynamics. What are dynamics? Okay? The definition, if you just Google define dynamic, okay? It says marked by usually continuous and productive activity or change. And that word change is kind of what's interesting in the context of what we're going to talk about today. Okay? So dynamics is what allows us to change the music's volume. Okay? So for example, imagine you were listening to a song and it started out as quiet and then it stayed quiet that whole time. Okay? That would be a little bit boring, or a song that started out really loud and stayed loud the whole time. It never got more interesting by getting softer in one part and then getting loud again, or the opposite. Music doesn't do that, okay? The volume changes for almost every song that you can find. At some point, there's going to be some sort of volume change or a dynamic change. So dynamics in music can be defined as the volume of music, right? If I'm sitting in my car and I decide that I want to turn the volume up on the song that I'm listening to, that means it's going to get louder. Or if I want to turn the volume down, that means it's going to get quieter, right? So volume is how loud or soft the music is. Okay, here is an example of dynamics making a song very interesting. This is a composer named Haydn from the 1700s, and this is his Symphony number 94. And it's been given the nickname the Surprise Symphony. So listen and see if you can decide why. All right, so you probably can guess it's called the Surprise Symphony because there's a surprise, really, really loud part in that song. So if we look back in the music, in this beginning part, it was quiet, right? As we moved on to the next page, it got even quieter here. And then all of a sudden, there's this really loud bang noise almost. Okay? And the story behind that is, we don't really know for sure because it was so long ago, but the story behind that is people tended to fall asleep in this portion of a symphony, kind of the middle portion. It was quiet, it was kind of slow, and people would fall asleep. And so Haydn decided that he was going to basically prank the people in his audience by playing this really loud, really sudden sound to scare them and wake them up. So he had a little bit of a sense of humor about it. He was kind of pranking them a little bit, okay? So that's the Surprise Symphony, which is an awesome example of how dynamics or the volume can change to make things a little bit more interesting. Okay, now the language of music we would say is Italian, and that's because most of the words that we use to describe how music is going to be played in music are in Italian. Okay, the reason for that is because there's this guy named Guido d'Arezzo who he was pretty much the first person who wrote music on a staff the way that we have today. Remember, a staff is 5 lines and 4 spaces, okay? He was the first guy to kind of do it that way, and he was from Italy. So the way that he wrote music began to get more popular, okay? Then throughout Italy, then it spread to the rest of Europe, and now the rest of the world has kind of adopted that structure. And when they adopted that structure of using a staff, they also just kept on using the words that he was using. So that's why they're mostly in Italian, because some Italian guy a couple hundred years ago decided that's how he was going to do it. Okay? Now, dynamic markings. Dynamic markings are these little symbols or sometimes little letters that are going to tell us how to play or sing the notes in music. Okay? For example, if I'm looking at my music, how do I know if I'm supposed to sing it loud or if I'm supposed to sing it soft? Okay? It's going to look like this in music. Okay? You can see this here in the middle. That is a type of dynamic marking we'll talk about later. This is a dynamic marking telling us to play these notes a certain way. This is a dynamic marking. Okay, so in your music, it's just going to look like this. It'll either be above or below or in the middle, and it's going to be some sort of symbol or some letters that are going to indicate how you're supposed to play. Okay, so let's talk about the word structure of these Italian words that we're using, okay? We have two root words for dynamic markings that we're going to use. Remember, root words is like the base word, okay? Our first one is piano, or if you're looking in your music, it'll just be a little P somewhere on the page, okay? And it means quiet. So if you're playing your instrument and you see a little letter P in your music, or the word piano in your music, that's not talking about the instrument. That's talking about playing it quietly, okay? Then our other root word or base word is forte, okay? Or in your music, you'll see a little F, okay? And it means loud. So if you're playing the clarinet and you see an F in your music or just the word forte, you're going to play that clarinet very loud, right? But then we have two add-on words. One of them is a suffix, okay? So first off, we have the word mezzo. Now in Italian, mezzo means moderately or kind of, and kind of makes a little bit more sense. So from now on, when we see mezzo, we're going to use kind of as the translation for that. Okay, you didn't know you were getting an Italian lesson today. Then we have isimo, okay? And that's a suffix, which means it's going to go on the end of a word, right? And if you see the word isimo, that means very, okay? So if we take our root words, piano and forte, and then mix and match them with our little add-on words, the word mezzo and the suffix or little tag on to the end, isimo, we can get all sorts of different combinations and all sorts of different dynamic levels, okay? So for example, pianissimo, or just two P's in your music. Pianissimo, if you look at that word, what do you think the root word is of pianissimo? Okay, hopefully you're saying to yourself, piano, right? And we remember from our last slide that piano means quiet, okay? And then here, as a suffix, we have isimo, okay? So we have piano and then isimo, which means, we remember from our last slide, very, okay? Which means that if you smush that together, piano, which means quiet, plus isimo, which means very, if you smush that together, it means very quiet. So that is our quietest dynamic marking, okay? Now what about mezzo piano? Sticking with piano here, we see the word piano, which we remember means quiet, okay? Now what about this mezzo? We remember mezzo means kind of, okay? And another way you'll see mezzo piano is just an MP in your music, okay? So mezzo means kind of, piano means quiet, so if you add that together, that means that mezzo piano means kind of quiet, right? All right, great. So moving on. Fortissimo. So what's our root word in fortissimo? It's forte, right? Which, if we remember from our last slide, means loud. Then we have isimo. Remember, isimo is a suffix that means what? We remember from your last slide, very, right? So loud or forte plus issimo, which means very. If you add that together, it's going to mean very loud. Then, exactly the same as piano, we also have mezzo forte, okay? Mezzo means kind of, right? Let's wait for that to go out of the way. Mezzo means kind of. Forte means loud. So mezzo forte means kind of loud. Okay? Moving on. Now, what if I want to start off as piano and get fortissimo, right? I want to start as quiet and get to fortissimo, which is very loud, right? But what if I don't want it to be like that surprise symphony where it's just suddenly really loud and scares everybody? I want it to be more gradual. I want to slowly work our way up to being nice and loud, okay? Then you're going to use something called a crescendo, okay? When you see a crescendo in music, that means you're going to gradually get louder, right? You're going to gradually get louder, and it's going to look like this, okay? It's a little almost like an angle in math class, right? A very acute angle, okay? And when it's small or closed off like this, that means it's the quieter side. So here we have pianissimo. And as it opens up and gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it kind of makes sense that we're going to get louder and louder and louder gradually until we end up at fortissimo, right? So we start here at pianissimo, and as this gets bigger and bigger, we get louder and louder until we eventually reach fortissimo. Okay, and you can change if you were going to write music, you could change these dynamic markings to whatever you wanted. You could go from pianissimo to just plain old piano, from very quiet to just quiet. It doesn't have to be from quiet to loud. It just means from a certain level to a louder level, right? Now, what about decrescendo? Now, this de is a prefix, right? It's decrescendo, or some people say decrescendo. Now, when you see that prefix de in a word, what does that typically mean? Typically, it means to undo something or to take away something, right? If I was going to deactivate my phone, for example, okay, that means I'm going to unactivate my phone, or maybe I'm going to turn it off. My phone is not going to be activated anymore, right? So if we're decrescendoing or decrescendoing, naturally, it just kind of makes sense that we're going to gradually get quieter, right? And it's going to look just exactly the opposite of the last one. Okay, we start here and we're fortissimo, and we're going to gradually, as this closes up, we're going to gradually get quieter, right? And again, this does not have to be from loud necessarily to quiet. It can be from fortissimo to just forte, just regular old loud. It doesn't have to necessarily mean that we're getting quiet. It just means we need to be a little quieter than this, right? So if I were going to drag and drop all of these little dynamic markings that you see here, if I were going to drag and drop all of these somewhere on this crescendo, okay? If I'm going to drag and drop those somewhere, what is going to be my loudest dynamic marking possible, right? We have mezzo forte, which means kind of loud, not crazy loud, but kind of loud. We have forte, which is just straight up loud, right? Then we have fortissimo, which is very loud, right? And that's going to be our loudest dynamic marking, and we're going to move it down here at the very end, or the largest end of that crescendo, right? Now, if we go up over to the opposite end, what is going to be our quietest dynamic marking? Okay, so quiet means we're looking for something with piano in it, right? So we look at this, we see mezzo piano, which means kind of quiet, not super quiet, but kind of quiet. Then we have piano, which is just straight up quiet. And we have pianissimo, which is very quiet, right? that is going to be our smallest or quietest dynamic marking. So we're going to slide this down here to the smallest end of our crescendo, right? Now here in the middle is where it starts to get a little bit confusing, right? It makes sense for fortissimo to be here and for pianissimo to be down here because they are our quietest and our loudest, obviously, right? But here is where it gets a little bit confusing, okay? Our next step up is going to be piano, okay? And you would think, well, shouldn't it be mezzo piano? But actually, mezzo piano means that it's kind of quiet, but really not super quiet, right? So if I say, if my dog I ask my husband when I get home, has the dog been good today? And he says, kind of. That means he wasn't really good, right? He wasn't as good as he could have been, for example, okay? So if I have kind of quiet or mezzo piano, it means it's not quite as quiet as this is, and definitely not as quiet as this is. It's kind of in the middle, okay? Now, by that same logic, we have mezzo forte, which means kind of loud, and forte, which just means flat out loud, okay? Same thing, mezzo forte means it's kind of loud. It's not really super loud, but it is kind of loud, right? Then we move on. Our next step up is forte, which just means loud. And then we have our loudest one, fortissimo. So if we start here at the quietest point, we have pianissimo, which is very quiet. We move up to just, okay, now we're just quiet. We move up even more to where we're kind of quiet. We're not super quiet, but we kind of are. Now, here at mezzo forte, things are starting to get kind of loud because mezzo forte means kind of loud. Then now, okay, we're officially loud here at forte. And then here, this is very loud or fortissimo, right? So this is an awesome example of dynamics being used to make a song more interesting and to kind of tell a story, okay? This is a piece by this old guy whose name was Edvard Grieg, okay? He was a Norwegian, and he wrote this piece that's called In the Hall of the Mountain King. And here's the deal. Even if you say you don't know any classical music, I promise you have probably heard this song somewhere, either in a movie or on a TV commercial, or I've even seen it on TikTok, okay? So let's take a quick little listen. We're actually going to skip a little bit to the end because you're going to hear the whole piece in just a second. So we're going to skip, but here's just a little clip from the song to kind of wake you up and see if you've heard it. Right? I would be willing to bet money that most of us have heard that somewhere before. Okay? Now, this next part, I don't know if you've ever heard about a game called Line Rider. Okay? It was pretty popular when I was growing up, which feels like forever ago. But anyway, Line Rider is a game where you can draw these lines, and a little guy on a sled will sled down whatever lines you draw. And you can see that this guy is kind of drawing some music. You can see here is our treble clef, okay, and here's our bass clef, which we haven't talked about yet, but you can see here that this is a dynamic marking, and if you look at it, you can see it's the dynamic marking for pianissimo, which means very quiet, right? So he's telling us here at the very beginning, we're going to get very, very quiet. So we're going to watch this first little bit. I'll pause it and explain something else. And then I'm just going to go ahead and let you guys watch this whole thing. So check this out. This is so cool. All right, so you can see, I got to go back just a little bit. you can see right here, we have a new dynamic marking, which is piano or quiet. Now, the rest of them, it happens so fast, things are about to get crazy. I'm not going to be able to pause it, but keep an eye out and see if you can see as well as hear these dynamic changes, okay? Check it out. All right, so you can tell obviously that guy spent hours working on that, but it's so cool to watch because you can literally kind of see how the music works and you almost hear it differently because you're visually seeing every little moving piece of that music. Okay, so I hope that you were able to see and recognize and also hear some of those dynamic changes happening. As always, if you have any questions, please send me a message. I hope you guys are having an awesome day, and I will see you soon, all right? So remember, be kind, try to make somebody smile today, and as always, thank you for tuning in. Bye, guys.